Patrick Stubbe with Bloomberg News, as you've already heard. And I'm just going to go right into questions and let's get started. Dr. Maloney, I'll start with you. We've had a nuclear agreement now with Iran for a little over a year. It's been in place for that long. How has the safety of the Middle East been changed over that time?
Thank you for a big and tough question to start off.
That's what I do.
And I wanted to thank the World Affairs Council for inviting us to be here tonight and giving us the opportunity to discuss what I think is a very important issue, an issue that's come up quite frequently already in the presidential campaign in the United States. We are approximately 9 months into the nuclear deal. It was signed in July of 2015. It went into full implementation in mid-January of this year. And my assessment is that it's been a very positive development in terms of arms control. What it has achieved is considerable reductions in Iran's centrifuge capacity and its stockpile of low-enriched uranium. It has imposed significant limits on research and development. It has blocked Iran's plutonium pathway to a nuclear bomb. It has set Iran's breakout time, the amount of time that it would take the Iranian government to move from its current position to nuclear weapons capability, from what was a few months or even less prior to the nuclear deal to well over a year. And that breakout timeline will stand for at least the next 15 years. That's all a very positive development. But obviously, the nuclear deal hasn't resolved the wider range of issues that we face in the region. It has not tempered the conflict, the sectarian and strategic conflict between Iran and many of the Sunni Arab states of the region, nor has it produced a sort of easy pathway to a rapprochement or a resolution of the estrangement that has existed between the United States and Iran since November of 1979. I think it's a testament, the deal is a testament to what we can do when we engage diplomatically, when we have a seriousness of purpose, when we're willing to commit resources and time and energy, and the priority of both sides to try to find a common solution that serves both their interests and needs. But I think that some of the challenges that we face, and we're going to talk quite a bit more about them as we move on, in many ways, and this is somewhat ironic, I'm sure, for Ambassador Mousavian, who dealt with the nuclear issue day in, day out for many years, many of the challenges that we face are even more complicated than that challenge and are going to require an even more creative solutions and an even greater investment of time and presidential attention than the nuclear issue has.
Ambassador Mousavian, what's your assessment of that? You told me when we were talking before we got started here that this was one step among many, but at least we're moving in the right direction here.
First of all, hello to everyone. I also would like to thank the World Affairs Council for invitation and thank you all for participating at the event. I agree with Suzanne that the deal was perhaps the greatest achievement on non-proliferation because this is the most comprehensive deal on non-proliferation during the history of non-proliferation, which creates the highest level of transparency measures, intrusive inspections, and also closes all pathways toward nuclear weapon. But I have a different understanding about the positive impact of the deal on perhaps bilateral issues. I think the US stood against the rights of Iran, the legitimate rights of Iran for peaceful nuclear technology for 36 years. And Iran was going to have, everyone knows the nuclear program, Iranian nuclear program, basically was founded by the US before revolution. The US laid the foundation of a nuclear Iran. It was not Islamic Republic of Iran. And the US was going to, for Iran to have full fuel cycle and 20 nuclear power plants. It was all before revolution, but right after revolution, when Iran decided to have only one nuclear power plant, the US said no. The power plant was built by Germans, 8 billion Iranians, they were paid, 90% was finished. The US said, 1980, said no. But the deal now opens the way for Iran to have peaceful nuclear technology. Iranians from the beginning, they have maintained they are not after nuclear bomb. The US never trusted. That's fine. Now we have the deal, which everybody now is convinced there is not going to be any nuclear bomb through this deal. But the deal opens the way, the doors for peaceful nuclear cooperation between Iran and the international community. And I think this is an opportunity for the US companies to engage with Iran on peaceful nuclear technology. Already the US is importing Iranian heavy water, and it's unprecedented after revolution. Now Iran is exporting heavy water to the US. This is something we should look at the deal for a new opportunities for the two countries. But on the regional issues, the regional crisis started long before the nuclear deal. Really, it has nothing to do with Iranian nuclear deal. ISIS, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, all of this is years from 2011, before 2011, Iraqi crisis after 2003, Afghanistan after 2001. There is a misunderstanding here in the US, perhaps in Iran also, that the nuclear deal should have helped to resolve all problems between Iran and the US.
I would be asking a lot of one agreement.
From the beginning, Richard, it was agreed between Iran and the US, Iran and the world powers, that this would be only about the nuclear and nothing else. Therefore, we should not expect anything beyond the nuclear. First of all, we should try to implement the deal precisely, comprehensively, timely. Second, we should know what can be the implication of the deal for the regional crisis. I would say the nuclear deal has created a model how we can resolve the crisis, the disputes peacefully through diplomacy rather than war, rather than coercion, rather than sanctions, rather than pressures. This is a model of successful diplomacy to manage one of the biggest international crises. I think we can use the model for the other crises. This is my understanding.
Let me ask you a question. You mentioned that the original plan in the 70s was to build 20 nuclear power plants in Iran, and it was. And now, how much nuclear power does Iran need? In this country, nuclear power is under a great deal of pressure, and those old plants are being phased out in some ways, and we actually have fewer nuclear plants than we had 10 years ago.
The study was done, Richard, by Stanford University in 1970s that Iran needs 20 power plants, nuclear power plants by 1994, the time when Iranian population was 25. Now we are 2017, population is 80. Therefore you can see we have only one nuclear power plant after 36 years. Russia has signed another new agreement with Iran to have 2 new nuclear power plants. They are negotiating for another 8 nuclear power plants. But Chinese also are there. They are negotiating to have a new agreement for new power plants in Iran. I think this is a big opportunity for Europe and the US to jump in also and to have a share on nuclear industry of Iran.
One reason that the world is interested in Iran, maybe the largest reason, is that Iran is home to about 10% of the world's proven oil reserve. 150 billion barrels of oil is what I read today was accurate. Since last summer, the exports from Iran have grown by about 800,000 barrels a day. how high can they go? And I guess I haven't really addressed the question to either one of you, but Dr. Maloney, maybe I should start with you.
Well, I think it's quite clear that Iran was poised to revive its production in a fashion that was even more rapid than many outside experts anticipated. I think this speaks to the level of technology and human capabilities in the Iranian oil sector, which has been obviously cut off from the United States for most of the past 37 years in terms of training and technology transfer, but also over the course of the past decade has really seen connections with even European and Asian companies deteriorate as the intensive sanctions that helped produce the negotiating environment that led to the nuclear deal were applied and drove most international firms out of the Iranian marketplace. The Iranians have moved quickly and are, I think, in a position to begin to court companies from around the world, which they've been doing. They've now finalized a new petroleum contract, which is going to be more attractive than the model that was in place for most of the past 20 years, which was a model that many Western companies found did not, in fact, maximize the benefit either to foreign investors or to Iran. But because of the ideological constraints, was a model that Iran had a great deal of trouble moving away from. So we have a new model of a contract which may permit greater foreign investment. We have the removal of most of the multilateral sanctions, the UN sanctions, the European Union sanctions, and the sanctions that had been imposed by individual states all around the world because of the concerns about Iran's nuclear program. But unfortunately, we still have American sanctions very much in place. And I say unfortunately for Iran because it really does complicate the process for all companies to do business with Iran, simply because of the restrictions on financial transfers and because of the hangover effect of this very severe sanctions regime that existed, particularly in the final years of the nuclear crisis. Investment has moved slowly to date, coming back to Iran. And this is also a factor, I think, of the political risk that many companies are watching very closely. We've had, even today, a very prominent Iranian-American consultant and his father sentenced to a 10-year prison term for cooperation with the US government. These sorts of developments, as well as the banking opacity and other problems of corruption and financial mismanagement within Iran, will mean that the process of luring foreign investment, the process of fully rehabilitating the Iranian energy sector, will probably move slowly.
What are the next steps that have to happen before the U.S. is going to look at some of those sanctions and say, maybe we can ease back on that? And in which direction is that going to come from? Is that going to come from Iran doing things that people in this country look at and say, this is a good development and we can take another step forward? Or is it going to come from someone like Exxon or Chevron saying, we'd really like to get in there and make some money and extract some oil, and it would be really helpful if those sanctions went away?
I think there's certainly a level of frustration among American companies about the fact that we've now reverted to a situation that existed prior to 2006, when European companies were free to do business in Iran, Asian companies were free to do business in Iran, and it was only the US that was cut off from the Iranian marketplace. There is some frustration there, but I think there's also a lot of realism about the political risks with respect to Iran, realism about the financial and reputational risks, given the long reach of the US Treasury Department and the very severe penalties that have been imposed, particularly against financial institutions which did business with Iran over the course of the past 15 years. And so I think what will happen is not a lobbying campaign, but what will have to happen is significant changes in some of Iran's other policies that would warrant a rethinking of the way that we approach Iran. It's not inconceivable. If you look, we've removed sanctions from a number of countries around the world, from Burma, from Libya, from Iraq. The experience with desanctioning is in fact there, but what we haven't yet seen is a significant shift in the way that Iran approaches the region, in Iran's support for violent groups and terrorist groups around the region, in its meddling in the affairs of some of its neighbors, and in its treatment of its own people. And those are the rationales for these other sanctions. And I think that there is a very strong support within Congress to maintain them, and that support is likely to only grow.
Ambassador Mousavian, I guess the same question to you. Where do the pressures to end these sanctions come from?
It's officially announced that Iran is going to have a minimum $200 billion projects on oil industry for next 3 years. This is a good news. The second good news is that there is no ban from the Iranian side for American companies. If there is any sanctions, bans, legislations, everything is from the US side. There is nothing from Iranian side. The oil minister of Iran publicly, officially announced that Iran is open for American companies to come to get projects on oil industry, petrochemical, gas. And when I was talking to him privately, I asked him whether this is the position of the minister or the country. He said, definitely this is the position of country. Everybody at the highest level, they agree and they would support. If the US industry, oil industries are willing to come to get a share of this huge cake. Therefore, everything the ball is in the field of the US. Iranians are ready, projects are there. Political risk, Suzanne, frankly speaking, when you are looking at the Middle East, Iran is, if not the most stable, is one of the most stable countries. If a country can resist for 36 years under the most coercive sanctions, pressures, covert war, military war, and still to be the most powerful, stable country in the region, I think this is the minimum risk if you really want to. The political risk is because of the US sanctions. It's not because of this stability in Iran.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the pressure to ease those sanctions is going to have to...
See, the Boeing made a good lobby in Washington. They got 118, they got a deal to sell 118 Boeing for $27 billion to Iran. Now it's for Houston, the capital of energy, to move, to push Washington a little bit. Otherwise, if they push, they can get over $50 billion projects on Iranian gas, oil, petrochemical.
Unless, of course, the Revolutionary Guard comes in and pushes out an American company, as they've done in the past with other foreign investors.
No, it is not really the case. It is a decision by country to permit American companies to come, to invest, to have projects in oil, gas, petrochemical. If you are going to take McDonald's in Iran, nobody would welcome. Because Iranians, they say, we have already good healthy foods, let's keep it for yourself. But the oil, the high level technologies, power plants is something else, you know, this is different.
What will, if I am ExxonMobil and I have the best technology in the world for extracting oil, what are my risks in going into...
See, Richard, if they want to come... No, first of all, if they want to come to Iran, there is no legal ban. Second, Iranians publicly have welcomed. The risk is, I said, with the US sanctions. However, if they can make different lobbies in Washington in order to ease the sanctions for the US oil companies to involve in the Iranian oil projects, when they sign an agreement, before they spend $1, the contract goes to the Organization for Protection of Foreign Investment. Would be approved there and the foreign company would get sovereign guarantee from Iranian economy ministry that the investment would be totally secured. If anything happens, they would be able to take from Iranian money outside. Therefore, there is a very good, powerful law to protect foreign investment. And after the nuclear deal also, since January, we have had $4.5 billion of foreign countries signing investment in Iran, getting foreign investment protection.
This is pledged foreign investment. Okay. So I have a friend who's a lawyer, as I assume all of you have friends who are lawyers, and one of the things that he tells me is if you don't trust a person, there's no contract in the world that is going to be perfect. There's always going to be a way out. There's always going to be something going on there that you want to have contracts, but you still need to trust the person you're entering into a contract with. And I guess my question is, what's the trust level right now, and what is it going to take to increase it?
It depends really a lot to the political will of the US administration and the US Congress. For the first time after revolution, Iran and the US have negotiated at very high level foreign ministers on one of the biggest crises. The US officials were saying continuously that the Iranian nuclear program is a security threat number one to the national security of the US, or a priority threat to American national security. They have been able to resolve, to agree peacefully. But since then, in less than 1 year, the US Congress has pursued 30 legislations to bring more sanctions on Iran. It is the biggest legislations during the history of Iran-US, 30 legislations in 1 year, less than 1 year. Therefore, Iranians, they say, look, they are not really sincere. They have
And of course, I think there's a similar problem.
If you want to talk, I can tell.
There's a similar problem from this end. I think it's a little bit disingenuous to present this in terms of lobbies. Lobbies have a role. Lobbies inform and engage and often advocate strenuously for issues. But the US policy toward Iran is not the product of a lobby. It's a product of consistent assessment of the strategic threat that emanates from Iran's involvement with terrorism, its policies toward its neighbors, and its nuclear program. This is not a Democratic policy, it's not a Republican policy. It is the most bipartisan foreign policy issue you will ever find in a very divided Washington. Every American president, from Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan to both President Bush's, President Clinton, and President Obama, have all sought to engage Iran diplomatically, most with very limited results. President Obama, this deal is the first time I think we can really look, perhaps since 1981 when we signed the Algiers Accords that resulted in the freeing of our 52 hostages who'd been held for 444 days. This is the first deal that we've actually been able to do with Iran. But every American president has sought to engage Iran, but every American president has also sought to imply pressure to Iran because of the concerns about its destabilizing activities in the region, its support for violent actors, its rejection of the peace process, and a consistent disregard for the sovereignty of its neighbors. These are not the products of lobbies, and the distrust is not the product of a sort of congressional obsession with sanctions. It's a product of a country that is still led by an unelected supreme leader who on a very regular basis speaks of the United States in the most vile and disgraceful terms. This is not a country that, despite the economics and the oil ministers and others who are eager to see American businesses come, who are eager to see the residual sanctions begin to collapse. This is not a country that is yet fully prepared to engage with the international community on the terms set by the international community itself. Iran does not yet respect international norms for its foreign policy or for its domestic policy.
Where are we on where are we on the trust scale then? If there's a 10-point trust scale, are we? I can't imagine you're going to say 7.
No, but I say this actually as someone who I've lived and studied in Iran. I've spent most of my adult life focused on this country. I have enormous respect for Iranians. I love the country. I do not love the government. And I think that what we have been able to establish over the course of the past 3 years, for the first time, is this bilateral level of regularity, normalizing the diplomatic contacts. Again, it was largely from the Iranian side that this was impossible for most of the past 37 years. As I said, every American president tried. President George H.W. Bush actually once took a 45-minute phone call from someone pretending to be the president of Iran. Americans have always been eager to find some way to resolve this crisis, but it entails an official, authoritative, trustworthy Iranian partner. We've had that on the nuclear issue. It was hard, it was unpleasant, but I think we have proven it's the one place, or one of several places, Ambassador Mousavian and I would agree, we have proven that it can be done on one discrete issue, and we should look for other issues where we can cooperate.
Suzanne mentioned 2 issues, nuclear and terrorism. Nuclear, the deal is done. The US is convinced the deal would guarantee every objective guarantees toward non-weaponization. And Iran has accepted the most intrusive inspections during the history and between every country in the world. No other country.
And as far as we know, there have been no violations to this point.
No, the IAEA also have confirmed, the US has confirmed, the other world powers, they have confirmed that Iran has complied fully with its commitment within the nuclear deal. There is no complaint. Okay. On terrorism, let's be a little bit frank, Today, the US officially has announced ISIS, Al-Qaeda, is the biggest terrorism threat to the world security, peace, and stability. It's publicly said, recognized. Europeans also the same, Russians the same. UN resolution also says this is priority threat to international peace and security.
The Islamic State is the leading threat.
Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, we have many of this. We have President Obama, the current president, Hillary Clinton, candidate, and Trump, the candidate. All 3 have said Saudi Arabia is the source of this type of terrorism and extremism. Read Obama's interview with Atlantic, the WikiLeaks revealed from Hillary Clinton by New York Times saying Saudi Arabia is source number 1 of terrorism. At the same time, everybody understands here Saudi Arabia is the source number 1, the biggest threat, the home for ideology, for money, for weapon. And the US is selling $110 billion weapon to Saudi Arabia. This is the US. And then we are talking differences between Iran and the US on terrorism. If really ISIS is the threat number 1, Iran is the leading force in Iraq and Syria on the ground fighting ISIS. No other country on the ground is fighting like Iran ISIS. And the US knows. The chief of staff of the US publicly announced. John Kerry publicly said, Iranian role fighting ISIS is positive, constructive. The US is leading force on airstrike. Iran is the leading force on the ground. We have differences. I agree with Suzanne on terrorism, but everything relates to jihadi groups related to Israel. This is about Hamas, Hezbollah, this is about Jihad Islami. This is about Israel issue. But if you go to every other country in the region, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Ahrar al-Sham, Boko Haram, they are everywhere. The source is Saudi Arabia. And the US has the most strategic relation with Saudi Arabia. And at the same time, they are blaming Iran on it. But this is
All right,
really.
Dr. Maloney, you've been holding your tongue, go ahead.
We have some common interests. We have some shared threats. I think that's absolutely true, and it has been true for many years. And I hope that we can find ways to work together in a way that's constructive, in a way that actually addresses the source of the threats rather than exacerbates them. And I think one of the issues that we have is that we certainly do recognize that Iran is playing a role in the campaign against the Islamic State. But it is also helping to foster the conditions that have enabled the Islamic State to gain support among Sunni Arabs. The Shia militias that are empowered by Iran, that are funded, directed, and very much operationalized by Iran, are part of the problem. They are not ultimately part of the solution. And this is why, despite some hopes, it really, the possibility of cooperation, of direct collaboration between the United States and Iran in the counter-ISIS campaign has never really come to fruition, because ultimately we're not fighting with the same sorts of soldiers. And ultimately, our interests in what happens to the states of the Middle East are very different. What Iran wants to do is sustain a dominant role in Iraq, whereas the United States would like to see Iraq emerge as a fully independent sovereign nation, led by its own government. What Iran would like to do is ensure that Bashar Assad, a brutal dictator who drops barrel bombs on civilians, on hospitals, on children, stays in power so that Iran can continue to support its other proxies around the region through funding and arms that need to pass through Damascus. The United States obviously would like to see Bashar Assad to go. So while we may have a common enemy in the region, our fight will not be a common fight until and unless we can come to some agreement about the way that the Middle East order needs to operate in order to be just, in order to be durable, in order to actually create peace rather than creating the conditions for greater conflict.
Richard, you should not be really surprised if you have differences, me and Suzanne. But how we see the root causes of the crisis today in the Middle East. She is saying everything Iran. You would hear from many Americans, Iran. Okay. But what we see is different. The US military strike on Afghanistan, on Iraq, on Libya, dismantled these three countries. Although the US spent $6 trillion, 7,000 Americans, they were killed, 50,000 maimed. I wish this 6 trillion had been invested on the infrastructure in the US. When I go to train stations, this is like third world country. But what the conclusion, the outcome of the US attacking Libya? Libya is totally collapsed. Al-Qaeda is there. Nobody is doing anything. The problem of expanding of terrorism, frankly speaking, one of the root causes was the US military strike attacking these three countries without able to manage the crisis after the attack. Obama, of course, said if I'm going to reconsider my policies, I would reconsider our attack in Libya during his period, but already he blamed the previous administration attacking Afghanistan.
Okay, I'll see your point.
The second root causes.
Answer me a question, Ambassador.
If you are the United States and you're saying, what should the United States policy and actions be in the Middle East? I mean, you've told me some things that you think shouldn't have happened.
I would say really if you
sketch that out for me.
I would say if you are really sincere for democracy and human rights, leave your double standards. Words with action. For 60 years, the US has been the dominant force of the Middle East. No doubt about it.
For 6?
60 years.
I was going to say, 60 sounds more like it.
No, 60 years. The Middle East has been totally dominated by the US. And look at the Middle East today. It's 60 years of US domination, and you can see the Middle East. And of course, we should blame Iran because, but this is not really the case. But I would say, Richard, I would say If you really are after democracy, for 60 years you have supported the most corrupted dictators in the region. From Mubarak, Ben Ali, look at your allies. Saudi Arabia, where is democracy? Where is human rights? I mean, this is really the issue. If the US really is committed to human rights, democracy should show in action. Supporting dictators, calling for democracy for 60 years, these corrupted regimes are the source of poverty, unemployment in the countries like Egypt.
Dr. Maloney? This is easy for me because I just need to say Dr. Maloney. That's it.
You know, and I want to try to at least
We need
bridge some
Suzanne
of the
to say
gaps.
something positive, you know.
I'm going to try to bridge some of the gaps. I think that Ambassador Mousavian has raised serious flaws with American policy and serious challenges that the next president is going to have to face. And I think you've heard both candidates on the campaign trail with different types of rhetoric, but both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have pointed to the problem of financial flows coming out of the Gulf that have helped to support extremist groups around the region. They have, I know that Secretary Clinton has spoken in depth about concerns about the radicalization that has come from Sunni states in the Gulf as well as from Shia states. And so this is not a one-size-fits-all problem, and it's not a single enemy problem. I think it's absolutely accurate to suggest that for too long the United States has relied on the need for stable allies in the region, in part to secure and ensure the free flow of energy resources for which the entire international economy remains dependent, even if the United States is no longer quite so dependent. And that challenge has left us with a lot of unsavory allies and has created, I think, and nurtured some of the very grievances that we see some of these terrorist groups exploit. But I think it's also misleading to suggest that's been the sum total of American policy. American development assistance,
No, I said part of it.
The legacy of American policy in the Middle East is not an entirely negative one, and I think, in fact, you will see that there are many places in which the U.S. has helped to create greater opportunity, greater for political voice, as well as for economic opportunity. And that challenge is going to be really difficult for the next president because there is no single ally on whom we can depend. The title of this discussion was, sort of friend or foe. We have in almost every state friends and foes, and we're going to have to work to try to engage each of our allies in the region as well as our adversaries in the region to help to create a better future for the people of the region. Because what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. It finds its way very quickly to Europe. It finds its way to the United States. And it is going to be priority number one. And in that, we're going to have to engage diplomatically with Iran, but that doesn't mean turning a blind eye to the extent to which Iran is part of the problem.
Both Iran and the U.S. are having elections within the next several months. The election in this country, thankfully, will be over in less than a month. But in May, there are going to be elections in Iran, and President Rouhani is going to be standing. What are some of the possible outcomes of that, and how will they affect the balance of power?
Iranian campaigns are very short, the official campaign, but the unofficial campaign has already begun.
Yes.
And there's already a lot of handicapping. We almost never get it right, those of us who study Iran from outside the country. So I will tell you my prediction, but you have to understand that anyone who predicts Iranian politics is inevitably shooting themselves in the foot. My expectation...
That's also true in people predicting this country's politics. So.
Even worse with respect to Iran, because we are inevitably almost always surprised. But I think this one election is one where we can count on a certain degree of continuity. Iran's presidents have each served 2 terms, at least those who have made it through their first term. That happened even when an election had to be rigged on behalf of President Ahmadinejad back in 2009. It's a time of, I think, generational transition within the Iranian leadership. There are expectations surrounding the longevity of Iran's supreme leader, and so I think that's another reason why mitigating in favor of a re-election for President Rouhani. He's part of the establishment, he's known, he's has his differences at times with different elements of the political establishment, but he is considered a relatively steady hand in his position. So I think he's also done obviously a good job in terms of delivering on the primary promise that he made when he was campaigning the first time around, and that was for the nuclear deal and the lifting of sanctions. So I think both in terms of the popular vote and in terms of the elite politics, which really do play a very important role in deciding the outcome of Iranian elections, it's a pretty sure bet that it will be Rouhani again. Having said that, I can tell you that I'll almost surely be wrong.
I'll do to that. Ambassador, what's your take on this?
No, I was trying to hear from Suzanne who would be elected here. On Iranian election, this is my experience for about 4 decades, that the Iranian nation is really unpredictable. Really unpredictable. Even the leaders, the politicians, they don't know 1 week before the voting day who would be elected. They always have surprised even the politicians. Therefore, I would say, forget it. We really don't know what Iranian nation, they are a very complicated nation. They won't tell you whom they are going to vote for. And that's why nobody could imagine Khatami would be elected in 1997. Nobody could imagine Rouhani would be elected in 2013. On the US side, I think both candidates, we would have more difficulties on Iran-US relations. Trump has said that he would tear up the deal. Even if he does not, Trump also is unpredictable. I mean, nobody knows really what he would do. But Hillary is predictable. I have no doubt Hillary would be much more tough on the Iranian issue compared to Obama. And when you read the DNC, Democratic National Committee platform 2016, is more hawkish than the DNC of 2012. 2012, when Ahmadinejad was president, if you compare the Democratic National Committee platform of 2012 with 2016, you would see Democrats are going to be more hawkish with the moderates compared to Ahmadinejad 2012.
I have some questions from the audience, and I'll start with you on this one, Ambassador. In light of the recent breakthrough in the battle for Mosul, how will the U.S. and Iran joint effort? How will that affect the U.S. and Iran joint effort to fight Islamic State?
Iranians at the very high level, they really believe ISIS has been created by Saudi Arabia and the US against Iran. They believe it is not against Syria, it is not against Iraq, ultimately this is against Iran. Saying that, on the reality today, as I said before, is that Iranians are the leading ground force cooperating with Iraqi government, Syrian government, fighting ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. And the US is the leading air force fighting ISIS. Therefore, practically they are fighting against ISIS, although they blame each other. If we can resolve Mosul, we can say ISIS would be very close to die in Iraq, but they would move to Syria. And our problems in Syria would get more and more and more complicated. Suzanne said about Assad, dictator. We have many dictators in the region, Suzanne, which is the region of dictators. And you would say Assad treated demonstrators bloodily. Yes, the other countries like Egypt, we have the same. We have in Bahrain the same. But if we have, let's say, based on your assumption, a dictator, should we export terrorist weapons to topple these dictators or attack? You did it already in Libya. What is the result? I think we really need to find some principles. This is my point. Before agreeing on principles, neither Iran and the US, nor the world powers and the regional powers, they can cooperate on each case without understanding on the principles. I would suggest the principles are: number one, agreeing on diplomacy rather than war. I mean, the experiences of US invading Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya is enough.
Also much cheaper.
Cheaper, yeah. Diplomacy like nuclear deal. Second would be the will of majority or the rule of majority. In Iraq, we have Shia majority. In Afghanistan, we have Sunni majority. In Yemen, we have Sunni majority. In Bahrain, we have Shia majority. We cannot have that standard. To fight the rule of minority, Assad, in Syria, and to support the rule of minority in Bahrain, then 15% Sunnis are ruling 80%, 85% Shia. It's not going to work. We should agree the second principle would be the will of the people. Third, true and a free election supervised by United Nations. Election in Syria, election in Yemen, election in Bahrain, everywhere.
Elections in Iran?
Iran already has election.
United Nations?
No, Suzanne, Iran, to be fair, Iran has election. 36 years after election, after revolution, we have had 37 elections. We have constitution voted by people. The president is elected directly by people. Parliament is elected directly by people. A leader is elected by a parliament elected by people. Therefore, the structure of election democracy you have in Iran, you don't have in any other of your allies, like Saudi Arabia. Therefore, it's better to invest on your allies, forget Iran for the moment. They are much more progress.
So three principles.
This is three. Number four would be power sharing.
How many are there?
That's the last one. Number four would be power sharing, like Afghanistan. We have Tajik Shia minority, Pashtun Sunni majority, they have power sharing. We should have power sharing, although Sunnis would have upper hand in Syria or in Yemen. We need to have Houthis, Zaydis in Yemen. We need to have Alawites in Syria. Power sharing.
Diplomacy, will of the people,
Election,
supervised by the UN,
and power sharing. And then, of course, everybody should cooperate.
That's always.
For a Marshall Plan, for reconstruction of these destroyed countries, for humanitarian, for refugees, for displaced people. This is a big issue.
Dr. Maloney, do you want to continue on that question, or
No,
do
she
you
is
want
going
to
to
have
confirm
this as a bonus question?
100% my 5 points.
I think those are wonderful principles, and if Iran would like to begin by withdrawing its Revolutionary Guard commanders from Iraq and Syria, if it would like to withdraw the
This is what I said.
troops
Before
that it sends into
every
Syria,
move,
and the
we should
financial
agree on the
support to
principle.
Bashar
But she
Assad.
says
Right, let her-
Iran
no.
to start, Iran,
Ambassador,
first we need to agree on
Ambassador,
the
you've had
principle.
your time. Let's let Dr. Maloney talk.
I think we can move to another question.
All right. Well,
I
then,
will
as
say
a matter of fact, I have a question right
Wonderful.
here. It's actually directed to you. Can you explain how it is that the largest terrorist threats to America are coming from countries that are not on the sponsors of terrorism list?
Well, the largest terrorist threat to the United States is the Islamic State, which is not a formally recognized country, and so therefore cannot be on the state sponsors of terrorism list. I think the relevance of the state sponsors of terrorism is a list that is very much generated by the concerns about countries that are formally giving funds to proxy groups around the region that are committed to violent upheaval in other states. I don't see why there would be any sort of a problem with sanctioning those countries for that kind of support. I don't think anyone wants to see more money flowing to Hamas, Hezbollah, to the Houthis in Yemen, or to other violent groups around the region.
Okay.
But she didn't talk about Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the
Those
source
are not
of
official funds.
supporting
Those are not
ISIS.
line items
everyone
in
knows
state budgets.
where is the sources of money, weapon, ideology. There is no sanction, no pressure, nothing.
There is considerable counterterror finance cooperation between all of these states and the United States and the international community. It's not just the United States, it's Europe, it's the multilateral institutions of counterterrorism financing. The Saudis and other states have put in significant constraints that have blocked some of those flows of money. They are not a line item in the state budget as they are with Iran. It's a very different sort of a relationship. It is absolutely a problem, as I think you've heard both presidential candidates talk about. It's a flow of funds that we have to deal with. It's a flow of extremist ideology that we have to deal with. But ultimately, it isn't relevant to the recognition of Iran's role in supporting other groups.
Ambassador, I have an oil question since we're in Houston here. The new petroleum framework in Iran was announced almost a year ago, but there haven't been any actual deals announced yet. What's responsible?
No, it was announced 1 year ago, but there was a lot of challenges within the country. Parliament had a lot of problem fighting between fractions. It was in the government. Ultimately, after almost a year of internal negotiation between administration, leadership, parliament, it is approved. It is about 3-4 weeks now, totally approved by the parliament, leader, administration, National Security Council. It's very new.
So when would you expect to see a major oil company or a major player outside Iran?
Already, if you are talking about China, the Chinese president visited Iran, signed $600 billion for next 10 years business with Iran. And I think about 70-80 billion minimum would be for the oil. The Chinese company, they have signed over 5 billion up to now during last few months. Russians also, they have signed some billions. And the Russian government has offered Iran $5 billion finance. You know, Russians, they don't give normal finance. Europeans also, Total and the other companies, they are going and they are negotiating for billions of dollars of, I think it would come to be realized on the East Bloc by India, China, Russia very soon, because the contracts are signed. With the West Bloc, Europeans perhaps after a few months. With the US, God knows.
See, I'm having a little trouble reading this question, but it's essentially, there's so many countries involved with Syria and the situation there. Does either of you see new borders being drawn in there to accommodate the Kurds, the Shias, and the other groups in there? I mean, or will we see a redrawing of boundaries in that region?
I want to say no, but I think in practice we're already seeing this evolve. I mean, we have an autonomous Kurdistan, and that will stand however it is integrated into an Iraqi state. In the future, it will continue to operate very much independently and as a fully independent power center from the central government in Baghdad. That has created obvious interest in other Kurdish populations in Turkey, in Syria, and in Iran. The question of how to put Syria back together, I think, is one that the international community is going to be confronted with for many years to come. It is a horrific tragedy that is unfolding before our eyes. You know, we are all of the generation that said never again, and to watch this play out, the 100,000 people who have been killed, the millions who've been forced from their homes, and again, not staying in the Middle East, but departing for many other parts of the world. it makes it very difficult to envision a wholly contiguous Syria remaining in its existing borders. But none of the states in the region would like to see Syria carved up into various protectorates. That's not ultimately a long-term recipe for stability. And so I think that this is just going to be a huge uncertainty until we can come to an agreement, a peace deal that provides for a more responsible leadership, that enables some kind of a process of national reconciliation and repatriation of the millions of displaced people.
Pastor, how do you see this?
I think the day we would have the first redrawing of the borders, the first disintegration anywhere, whether this is Kurdistan of Iraq or Syria, I don't know. The day we have the redrawing or disintegration, that would be the beginning of the end of Middle East. You would not be able to control the breaking down of other countries because many borders are artificial. Is just some years. Some of the countries in the region are younger than me, and you know, yeah. Therefore, we have to really be very careful to fight collectively to prevent any disintegration, because nobody would be able to manage if one is disintegrated. One.
So if Syria falls apart, that's a...
No one Syria, to be realistic. We need to be realistic. Assad, with its military forces, army, and security establishments, are the most local establishment within Syria fighting ISIS, Al-Qaeda. There is no other alternative. If Assad goes today, Syria would be worse than Libya, and the US would escape. Nobody would be able to do anything with Syria. To be realistic on the ground, we need to cooperate with the security military establishment of Syria to wipe the terrorists out of Syria first. Because what comes first? The US, Saudi Arabia narrative some years ago was Assad must go. Now Washington understands it was a mistake. Europeans, they understand they made a mistake saying Assad must go. Now the issue is if they cooperate with the security military establishments which are under Assad, how they would be able to guarantee a transitional period which would lead to a free election by the Syrian nation to decide about the future president constitution. I think this is the way to go. We should agree first terrorist groups, second leave it to Syrian nation. Iran is really ready to shake hand and to cooperate as one of the guarantors. Syria is another one. Saudi Arabia is another one. Turkey is another one. US is another one. They all have to agree to really cooperate after wiping the terrorists of Syria. Then we would go for a transitional to a free election.
Why would President Assad agree to any of the conditions?
No, Assad would be the man who served the integrity of Syria. I think that's enough for him, because at the end, they need to agree for Alawites as power-sharing system. They are not going to kick all Alawites. See, we have majority of Sunnis in Syria. But majority of Sunnis in Syria, they are secular. They are not like Salafis, Wahhabis, they are different. Syrian Sunnis, they really like more Assad because they can go to discos, dance, everything is free, women's, no chador, curtain, nothing, you know. But Salafis, Wahhabis, if they are there, the majority of Sunnis would be in problem. Christians, they like Assad more. Alawites, they like Assad more. If compared with Salafists, Wahhabists, they prefer Assad. But forget it. let's say really terrorism is threat number one. To preserve the integrity of Syria, we need to fight ISIS to keep them out. And then let's agree on a really free election for the Syrian nation to decide about their future.
Dr. Maloney, what do you think about that?
And she can be the head of supervisor team on the election, you know, in Syria.
I think what you've just heard described is the tragedy of Syria in diplomatic and political terms. Remember how this began 5 years ago with peaceful protests by people looking for political freedom from an authoritarian leadership. That authoritarian leader responded with violence and brought in allies, most especially and most continuously Iran, to help support him in his campaign of violence against peaceful protesters. And what Iran's strategy has been, what Bashar Assad's strategy has been, is to give the world a choice between Assad and jihad, which is no choice at all. It is a pox on both their houses. Neither one of these forces can lead a peaceful Syria. A Sunni majority Syria is not going to live peacefully under Bashar Assad at this stage. There may have been a time where Bashar Assad looked somewhat tolerable, but that is not the case after he has bombed his country into submission, into dispersal around the region. There is no peace in Syria until and unless we find a power-sharing agreement that does not involve either Bashar or the jihadists.
Okay, I just got the 5-minute notice, and as it happens, I have one more question here. And we've talked about the Middle East all night, and I don't think Israel has come up, so this seems like a good time for that. The question is, to help remove barriers to cooperation, is Iran willing to consider removing the missiles pointed at Israel and create more cooperation with them?
Missile?
Excuse me?
To remove missile? Why?
To remove.
I assume this is referencing that on military parades, Iran often displays missiles that are emblazoned with
See,
anti-Israeli
the
slogans.
Iranian conventional arms is an issue that you need to understand the reason and the source. One, the US is exporting the most sophisticated weapons, tens of billions annually to neighbors of Iran, continuously. To Saudi Arabia, Israel, Pakistan, Turkey, everywhere. Second, American military forces are all around Iranian borders, everywhere. Third, the US policy up today has been coercion, pressure on Iran. I believe for at least until the second term of Obama, it was regime change. Suzanne does not agree with me, but I believe it was really regime change policy. Look at the collapsed nations, countries, failed states, terrorism. Look at the security atmosphere of Iran. Therefore, if you are sitting in Iran, the first decision you would do to have a very powerful army and security forces and conventional arms, because you cannot compete the US, $110 billion the US export in just some few years. The Iranian defense budget is even less than Emirate. Iran with 80 million, Emirate with 1 or 2. Therefore, Iranian missile power is part of Iranian conventional arm, is part of Iran's stability, is part of the necessities for Iran to maintain the security at the borders, the integrity of the country, to fight the threats, ISIS, even to be able to resist the possible military invasion of the US, because even up to today, the US policy against Iran is all options on the table. It means we may attack Iran. But at the end, if there is going to be a compromise, it has to be a collective compromise for conventional arms in the region. I mean, it is not, no one can only talk about Iran. We have to decide about the US militarization of the region by tens of billions of dollars of yearly export of sophisticated arms to countries which they have zero democracy.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes left, and Dr. Maloney, I'm giving them to you.
Notice that Ambassador Mousavian did not mention the word Israel in that statement.
No, Israel because
is
they
not
have
the
nuclear
primary.
bomb, you know, they should really get rid of this nuclear bomb because Israel is the only country in the Middle East with nuclear bomb. No other country has nuclear bomb.
Israel is not a threat to Iran. Iran's primary threats have come from its Arab neighbors. It was Iraq that invaded Iran, not Israel. Iran has legitimate security threats and needs. It has a legitimate right to have defensive capabilities. The type of rhetoric that Iranian leaders, not the Iranian people, but Iranian leaders use with respect to Israel is completely unacceptable. And the approach, the sort of expectation that Israeli legitimacy is consistently questioned is one that Iranians should appreciate how absolutely and fundamentally dangerous that is. Iranians who value their sovereignty, who value their own domestic independence and legitimacy, should appreciate that the kind of rhetoric and ideology and the support for violent groups that are committed to the destruction of Israel is perceived and equally understood as a very dangerous threat from the Israeli side.
Suzanne, if you can please try to convince the Israelis to go for your two-state solution first in order to resolve peace. If you can, you are trying for 60 years and your strategic ally Netanyahu is opposing your thesis for two-state solution. When you are talking about rhetorics, you always are only talking about Iranian rhetorics. You are not talking about Israeli rhetorics. Every day Netanyahu wakes up, says we should attack Iran. And it's not important for you if he repeated 400 times, we should attack Iran. But if Iranians, they say something, the US media, the first headline, Iran threatened Israel.
I'm going to cut you off. You have one more thing you'd like to say? All right. Well, I have 8:15 on the button here. So thank you.